When we think about a totalitarian regime like Mao's China, it's obviously very important to think about how that totalitarian power emerges. And for Mao in China, the most obvious catalyst towards the creation of a totalitarian state is the victory during the Chinese Civil War. And so then the next thing we would normally be talking about is we would be talking about the consolidation of power. So we could think about the emergence of totalitarian power in Germany is followed by the Gleichschaltung and the coordination, which happens during 1933 and 1934, up to the death of Hindenburg. If we're thinking about that same situation with Mao, it's more difficult because so quickly after the founding of the People's Republic of China, the Korean War breaks out. So that consolidation of power is tied up a lot with the Korean War. So I'd like to think a little bit about the consolidation of power in the first years of the People's Republic of China following the Civil War. But at the same time, I'd like to look at that in the context of the Korean War. I think it's difficult to address the consolidation of power completely because on the one hand, Mao and the communists had already been in control over portions of China for many years. And then there are some portions of China which they only get control of in 1949. And so that can be really difficult to unpack. It's October of 49 when Mao declares the People's Republic of China, and by June of 1950, the Korean War has begun. Already, even before the Korean War has begun, Mao has launched a series of reunification campaigns, and there's three big campaigns. There's a campaign in Tibet, in Xinjiang, and in Guangdong. So in the southwest, the northwest, and the south central, where there are campaigns that are being fought against predominantly Buddhist, sort of separatists in Tibet, or Tibetan Buddhists who aren't interested in being incorporated into the People's Republic of China. In Xinjiang, we're looking at a more Muslim population. And then in the south central, there's still some areas that feel like they're sort of GMD controlled. And so I think those are interesting contexts to view this consolidation of power. More so than in Soviet Russia, I think we can see the establishment of the People's Republic of China as being more fulfillment of popular hope than the betrayal of a revolutionary promise, to use the words of the historian Maurice Meisner. And I think that's an interesting idea. I mean, China really hasn't been fully unified for something between 40 and 50 years. And I think it feels having some sort of consolidation of power is probably welcome by a number of sort of normal Chinese citizens. So how does that compare to the popular sort of democratic rise to power of Mussolini or of Hitler, both of whom who had some popular support, certainly, although Hitler has dramatically more popular support than Mussolini. Well, people in China don't vote, so on the one hand, it's much less democratic, but there are some historians like Maurice Meisner who argues that it was a popular will that was being expressed. Mao announces that he wants to have 3 years of recovery from the Civil War and 10 years of development. And the philosophy behind this is the idea that the material forces of production, which Marx and Engels had described as being this massive capitalist engine that's going to transform the world and harness productive forces larger than the world has ever known, this still needs to happen, and this needs to precede a socialist transformation, and this hasn't happened yet. So Mao, in a piece of writing called On the People's Democratic Dictatorship, wrote that China must utilize all elements of urban and rural capitalism that are beneficial and not harmful to the national economy. Our present policy is to control, not to eliminate capitalism. And so this idea of a people's democratic dictatorship, to democracy, to Mao, democracy can mean the working class, it can mean the peasantry, it can mean the petty bourgeoisie, and it can mean the national bourgeoisie. So there's obviously no place for landlords. But other than that, there's a place in Mao's conception of what China can be like that transcends our typical ideas of what a communist state might be. China is still under military rule when the People's Republic of China is announced. It's divided into 6 different military regions, which each have a military commander who's in charge of them. And then because of the Korean War, this is going to stay in effect until 1954. So for the first 5 years of its existence, it's really still a state that's controlled predominantly by the military, even though GMD resistance is basically done by March of 1950. We sometimes think about how much was the consolidation of power the basis of fear or the basis of repression. So again, if we look to Mao's on the people's democratic dictatorship, he says, our present task is to strengthen the people's state apparatus. The state apparatus is the instrument by which one class oppresses another. It is an instrument for the oppression of antagonistic classes. It is violence and not benevolence. So Mao very clearly believes that the purpose of the state is to oppress the non-democratic classes. And this is part of his philosophy, and so strengthening the state and strengthening the forces of repression isn't something that needs to be done in secret. This can be done out there and in public because it's still part of the revolution. There's actually very little evidence that there's going to be any counter-revolution in China in late 1949 or early 1950. The GMD is eliminated as a threat on mainland by March. On the other hand, March, April, May, June, and then in June the Korean War is beginning again. So there's this other thing that has the potential to bring the revolution back. But I think the largest challenge that Mao and the Communist Party are facing in China before the Korean War is governing a large country that has a totally collapsed economy, no centralized administrative infrastructure to take over, and I mean, contrast that even to, so Italy obviously has a centralized state. Germany obviously has a centralized state. Russia, though severely weakened and depleted by the First World War, also has a centralized state that successfully waged war for, almost 4 years. So the challenges that Mao and the Communist Party are facing in China are unprecedented in our studies. And then all of a sudden, Korea revives the threat of external and internal enemies. And this threat is going to be met, on the one hand, head-on by the Chinese army, which is going to enter the Korean War in October of 1950. And then in terms of internal enemies, it's going to be early 1951, in February, when the regulations regarding the treatment of counter-revolutionaries legalizes and puts forward a method of control and repression and of eliminating the internal enemy. And so that leads to a large number of killings, of arrests. Ultimately, we think that about 2 million Chinese citizens will be murdered by the government over the first several years, from 1949 to 1953. And that's really a staggering number. I mean, I wonder if if some people would take exception to that word murdered, because they're not all extrajudicial killings. I mean, some of these people are tried, but executing 2 million people in a 4-year period is obviously an exceptional level of violence, which is probably only possible because of warfare. And here I might, although I don't think there's any really thoughtful comparison to be made between China in 1952 and Germany in 1943 in terms of comparing these killings to something like the Holocaust. I think that in both cases we see the ways in which war, World War II and Korea, allow the most extreme version of ideologies to come to the forefront. And so I think that when we think about the consolidation of power, it's not obvious how violent that consolidation was going to be outside of the Korean War. But the emergence of the authoritarian state of the People's Republic of China is made absolutely inevitable by the Chinese Civil War. I mean, Mao was always going to have to establish a people's democratic dictatorship and eliminate landlords, and there was always going to be this. But I think the type of dictatorship that the People's Republic of China ends up being is greatly affected by the Korean War. This really legitimizes the fears that you would need to justify internal repression, and it leads to this dramatic increase of repression. And remember, Mao is going to be basically victorious over the most powerful country on earth. So it also greatly enhances Mao's personal power. So when we think of the consolidation of power, and we look more towards 1953, 1954, we just have to remember that post-Korean War People's Republic of China was a very different place than post-Chinese Civil War People's Republic of China. And it's a place that's much more ripe for Mao's personal authority, for legitimized repression. And those things combine to create what feels like probably a different dictatorship than we would have had otherwise. And so that makes it interesting to think about the degree to which the Korean War was a war of choice for China and the degree to which they were forced into it, that it was a necessity. And one thought experiment, I mean, I think even if Mao has come up with a plan to take advantage of the Korean War, it seems difficult to imagine China totally being able to avoid being involved in a war right on its doorstep. And it seems difficult to imagine China being able to dissuade the Soviet Union from giving the North Koreans the go-ahead. And even though ultimately we see that it becomes a war of attrition and it's grinding, and we have Mao writing to Stalin about the number of the hundreds of thousands of casualties that he's willing to sustain and that he's planning on inflicting on the United States, I think at the same time, that's not the way the war started. And I think the Soviet Union rightfully could feel like the North Koreans were going to be victorious on their own, as they almost are. If you look at that map of the North advance, I mean, the United Nations begins its foothold with a very small area right around Pusan. And maybe that's illusory, but only if the United States gets involved. So it seems like if once the United States plans on getting involved, and it seems like that's the Soviet plan the whole time, right? Because we now have this new area of historiography done by, revealed by reports and by interviews with top Russian officials, that the reason why the reason why the Soviet Union gets involved in boycotting the Security Council is because they want the United States to be able to go to war. So the Soviet Union could have prevented the Korean War from becoming something more than Korea, and so could have had a faster war, but they don't want a faster war, and so it's difficult to imagine China being able to stay out of that faster war. Now, maybe Mao didn't want to stay out of the quick war anyway and wanted to be involved, but I think that's an interesting thought experiment about what would the People's Republic of China look like if there had not been a Korean War. So those are the base plates and the foundation that I'd like us to have for moving into the post-Korean War People's Republic of China and thinking about probably what will be the first peaceful consolidation of power.